Another important part about myths is that they tend to reenact part of the sacred. And as much as we talked about in the last video, the connection between the sacred and the profane that is accepted through the ritual, it is also quite possible for the ritual to allow the sacred to be just literally enacted within the profane. And the Iliad points out that the first dance, the first duel, the first fishing expedition, like the first marriage ceremony or the first ritual, became examples for humanity because they revealed the mode of existence of the divinity, of the primordial man, of the civilizing hero. And we've talked about this before as the myth showing the beginning of times and how the world got created by these supernatural powers, something that none of us would be particularly able to do. But once humanity is created, it is very easy to reenact this particular function of creating humans, at least the humans that live on Earth, not the absolute form of the human, the one that is exemplified by Adam, which is created from dirt. We can do that very easily by creating voodoo dolls, for example. However, we can also use our connection to Adam/Eve to create new humans by their own union to recreate this, and eventually making the act of sexual reproduction something that is very sacred or sacralized in a way in a profane world, even though in the grand scheme of things, reproduction is the most mundane, most profane thing there is to do. There is also a way in which we can use this process to reproduce our processes. And there's the fact that these rituals are practical lets us know how to change them. And this particular excerpt here is from the reading for this week by Gertz, pointing out that the religious tradition of Java, particularly of the peasantry, is a composite of Indian, Islamic, and indigenous Southeast Asian elements. So, because the rituals have existed through various eras of Javanese history and through the different larger ritual systems, they have come to integrate parts of the profane within them and essentially allowed for people to keep on practicing their ritual, their connection with the sacred, with their same connection in the profane way at the same time. The rise of large militaristic kingdoms in the inland rice basins in the early centuries of the Christian era was associated with the diffusion of Hinduist and Buddhist cultural patterns to the island. The expansion of international maritime trade to the port cities of the northern coast of the 15th and 16th century was associated with the diffusion of Islamic patterns. Working their way into the peasant mass, these two world religions became fused with the underlying animistic traditions characteristic of the whole Malaysian culture area. Animistic in the sense of animism, the very early reflections we had from it through Tyler. And as much as they can be, or they might have been considered at the time of Tyler to be strictly animistic, the fact that they have included elements of Hinduism and Islam makes those a lot closer to the as it's mentioned here, the broad world religious system, and in a way, again, kind of taking this apparently or conspicuously profane form of ritual into the more sacred realm from religion. The result was a balanced syncretism of myth and ritual in which Hindu gods and goddesses, Muslim prophets and saints, and local place spirits and demons all found a proper place. Syncretism is a word we have brought up before also in the context of eclectism, and eclectism being opposed by or opposed to syncretism by Diderot in the early encyclopedias. Syncretism is this connection or this blending, if you will, of various religious traditions into one. Here's a definition of syncretism that applies to voodoo, especially. Syncretism that resulted in voodoo was mainly a magical syncretism. That is to say, there was no formal religious acculturation as such, but mainly material acculturation. By material religious acculturation, I mean the process by which certain material elements borrowed from Catholicism and Indian religions, indigenous that is, were incorporated into the voodoo cults simply by juxtaposition, by putting them side by side. side. Such elements were incorporated as a parallel magical elements to strengthen the magical and religious power inherent in voodoo. So we have this kind of empty shell of religion, whatever it is, practiced variously differently by different people, but those people accorded some sort of magical power. If they already have this form of magical power that exists and connected to another magical power next to it, so the animistic quote unquote with the world religion next to it, those two tend to feed one another, and the quote unquote power of the images of Catholicism and Christianity in general became incorporated as symbols of power in voodoo as well, perhaps because they were a little bit more understandable by a wider crowd. So it is entirely viable to have this African religion, which would have very obscure symbols to the majority of the population in Haiti, which gathers a lot more meaning once it is connected with the religion of the colonial power of the people who apparently are in power in that place, and therefore they have the power of the religion with them. If you connect the power of their politics and the power of their religion with the power of your own religion, you have transformed this whole system into a completely new idea of syncretism. Now, as I mentioned it back then, syncretism is generally disregarded by major world religions such as Christianity, and this is the context in which it comes. This is kind of mentioned in biblical fathers as this adulterated, this kind of diluted form of Christianity that exists out there, not pure, not unique, and they do not see syncretism as a strength to Christianity as a whole. Although now that the world has changed a little bit and people have moved around, you can very easily how within the larger myth of Christianity, you can put more myth and more spiritual conditions into creating new variants of Christianity, getting us to well, the modern era in which we are living now. So, ritual here is allowing us to integrate the different parts of our lives, the more profane or the more sacred ones, into a larger system. And the most common form of religious celebration and religious reenactment that exists pretty much everywhere around the world is a communal feast, a time where people get together and eat, and through that meal, they get to reconnect with the higher spiritual values of them. Here, the central ritual form of this syncretism is a communal feast called slamatans, which are given the only slight variations in form and content on almost all occasions of religious significance as passage points in the life cycle. On calendrical holidays, at certain stages of the crop cycle, on changing one's residence, the are intended to be the both offerings to the spirits and commensal mechanisms of social integration for the living. So the feast the feast allows people to meet to meet at certain high points, holidays, festivals, or whatever. So again, calendrical holidays, life cycle, changing your residence or whatever. So you have a housewarming party, if you will, making the house, which was a cold space up until that point, more of a social place by gathering people in it. So it used to be somebody else's space that might have had its own history, its own mythology and whatnot. But once you make it your own, you appropriate that with the ritual, you create a new space that is going to be a lot more yours. And by the way, this is still from the Garrett's article from the reading for this week. So the feast, the gathering of people and the very specific rituals associated with that. So maybe a prayer before the meal, maybe treating the feast as a sacred time. No talking while you're eating, no cell phones at the table, no putting your elbows on the table and whatever. All of those are part of keeping the ritual of the feast as something that is a little bit of a sacred part of our life, something in which maybe the more the more mundane parts of our life are set apart. And again, right, this is why when you have these holidays, and you gather the whole family, even people in the family that you don't typically talk to, and eventually that the tempers flare and people get into fights at those holiday meals or over New Year's Eve or whatever, because you have these kind of high spirits, high moments that are gathered into one place, and crossing that line, kind of separating the profane life from the spiritual life is allowing for this very volatile moment. Garrett's also describes that the meals are sexually separated as well, that men and women don't work together. So again, repeating those patterns of myth into the daily life. So, feeding yourself as a person is also a way to feed your spirit as a person. Feeding yourself as a community is also a way to feed your community together. And in that context, you are feeding yourself as you are feeding the spirit. You are using this magic by imitation, by feeding yourself, you're feeding the spirit. So, your acts in the day-to-day life are also acting onto the spiritual life. You're also making contact through the food itself. You have this very physical relationship to something. And here it is said that the spirits draw their sustenance from the odor of food, the incense which is burned, and the Muslim prayer. The human participants draw theirs from the material substance of the food and from their social interaction. The result of this quiet, undramatic little ritual is twofold. The spirits are appeased, and this neighborhood solidarity is strengthened. So you're connecting people more, you're connecting people with their spirits, you're connecting people together, you're probably connecting the spirits as well, and you are looking for this much larger form of communal existence through the ritual. The article has a pretty extensive story of how the rituals adapted over the years. I'll let you read that one for yourself. But it is important to note that this is just the way that it is working. This is the way in which people are thinking of rituals very explicitly. This particular example here from Saint Basil of Caesarea, a third century writer on Christianity, so early years of Christianity, is telling us about the just as it is the so this is an address to people who are interested in Greek literature at the time, Greek being foreign to the people who are reading this. Just that it is the chief mission of the tree to bear its fruits in its season, though at the same time it puts forth the for ornaments the leaves which quiver on its boughs. And even so, the real fruit of the soul is truth, yet it is not without advantage for it to embrace the pagan wisdom, as also leaves offer shelter to the fruit and an appearance not untimely. So pagan being Greek in this context. That Moses, whose name is synonymous for wisdom, severely trained his mind in the learning of the Egyptians and thus became able to appreciate their deity. Similarly, in later days, the wise Daniel is said to have studied the lore of the Chaldeans while in Babylon, and after that to have taken up the sacred teachings. So, learning from other rituals has helped these great evangelists to pass on their rituals. By understanding how people relate to their spirits, you're able to kind of massage your own way to relate to their spirits to theirs. And as you probably know, this was recently a time of Catholic holiday and also of other related celebration. We are currently during Ramadan, a festival for Muslims. We are also getting towards the Persian New Year, the Persian New Year just happened. Also, of course, in Jewish tradition, the Passover. So all of these different all of these different times and places kind of connected with one another in their time, in their own space, and allowed for people to reconnect with their own spiritual life and also to reconnect with their ritual, which allows them to be more proficient, more mindful of the world that we are living in. And yet, all of these rituals are different, even though they fall in the same time of the year, even though they might have a similar connection to one another, even though the people themselves might live in pretty close proximity, they remain different, fundamentally different rituals. And so, in as much as we can think of this in the broad umbrella of a ritual, it is also important to see that this is a very mechanical format for the ritual to repeat itself and for society to repeat itself. And Leach is pointing out that if we look at the general types of behavior that we actually encounter on ritual occasions, we may readily distinguish three similarly contradictory species. On the one hand, there are behaviors in which formality is increased. Men adopt formal uniform, differences of status are precisely demarcated by dress and etiquette, more rules are rigorously and ostentatiously obeyed. An English Sunday, the church ceremony, an English wedding, the coronation procession, university degree taking ceremonials are examples of the sort of things I mean. In direct contrast, we find celebrations of fancy dress party type, masquerades, revels. Here, the individual, instead of emphasizing his social personality and his official status, seeks to disguise it. The world goes in a mask, the formal rules of orthodox life are forgotten. So kind of the possibility of doing the opposite of what the ritual says. And sometimes it can get also even more different. There are relatively few instances we find an extreme form of revelry in which the participants play act at being precisely the opposite of what they really are. Men act as women, women as men, kings as beggars, servants as masters, acolytes as bishops. In such situations of true orgy, normal social life is played in reverse, and all manner of sins such as incest, adultery, transvestitism, sacrilege, and lèse-majesté treated as the natural order of the day. This is something that you might have associated with Mardi Gras in New Orleans, for example, where people are dressing and drinking on the street and doing all kinds of things that I will not mention here. This is obviously only one way to celebrate Mardi Gras in Louisiana. There are many other ways that are more or less family friendly, but it is the most commonly known example of such a quote unquote relatively rare instance mentioned by Leach here, where the order of things can be reversed on the ritual manner, because this is the time where it is acceptable to make fun of the king. This is the time where it is acceptable to not work. This is a time where it is acceptable to do things that are not otherwise acceptable without breaking the order of things. So, from a ritual point of view, here we are bringing the sacred into the profane, and we can also bring the profane into the sacred by making that inversion that happens during the holiday. Perhaps you might have enjoyed in your own time Halloween. Halloween is one of those times of inversion where people are scary and spooky, but spooky is fun. And again, right, this is kind of an understood part of the ritual, although something that is of pagan origin now largely adopted by a variety of people. Again, by this weird connection between people and their society and their universe.